Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The age of extremists. The terror act waged on the city of Paris again demonstrates how the West's so-called war on terror works or doesn't work. The extremists on both sides of this divide claim Paris a victory. For the innocent, it's still another senseless and painful tragedy. To Crosstalk the Paris terrorist attacks, I'm joined by my guest, Gearóid Ó Colmáin in Paris. He is a journalist and political analyst. In London, we have Hafsa Kara Mustafa. She's also a journalist and political analyst. All right, Crosstalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Hafsa, if I go to you in London, it's been days now. There's been a lot of talk about what has happened here. And I'll be maybe a bit cold-hearted, but I'll ask you a very simple question that I think is on a lot of people's minds on both sides of the divide. Who benefits from this terrible acts in Paris?
Well, certainly not the Muslim community, certainly not the French people, but obviously all extremists from all sides benefit. The far-right movements have gained capital from this. They've had their little I told you so moment. The extremists, the fanatics are saying, well, there you go. Look, we can reach you even in the heart of Western capitals. So really the extremists are very much benefiting on this issue. But of course, the innocent civilians, regardless of their ethnicity or religious background, are actually the victims. Who benefits? Again, it's a difficult one. If we take the news coming out from Paris at face value, again, I suspect it would be a victory for Al-Qaeda and all those groups that are offshoots of the various terrorist groups that have burgeoned over the last 10 years. They can claim major victory given the impact that it's had and the resonance across the world. But again, you know, it's very complex. I think that news is sort of seeping through. We're having various conflicting pieces of information coming out, and the picture is yet to clarify at this point. So I think the answer to that is really difficult at this particular moment in time because the information just isn't very clear.
Gearóid, in Paris, I agree with that. We get down to a lot of I told you so because there's a lot of people in Washington and Western capitals that are saying it's time to take the gloves off, as if the gloves haven't been on for a very long time. And we see also that words coming out of Paris and other Western capitals is a renewed effort on the war on terror, which has a very bad road record coming out of the United States. It seems that this is a path of repeating the same mistakes over and over again, and no one wants to listen, no one wants to learn about what has happened to Western foreign policy in the Middle East, because given what we just heard in London, there's never really the connection to foreign wars in the Middle East. It's just this fanaticism. It's all about terrorist groups and not about where they come from and why they come about. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's completely absent from the debate here, particularly in France, since the attacks. I'd just like to allude to an interview that was given on France Inter, which is the state radio channel, in 2012 about the war on Libya. And the French anti-terrorist judge, Marc Trévidic, was asked if it was a problem for French foreign policy to find itself on the same side as, effectively, Al-Qaeda in Syria. And he responded that he was aware of the fact that jihadists were leaving Europe, leaving France, to go fighting in Syria against Bashar al-Assad, but that wasn't really a problem because they were fighting Bashar al-Assad and that they were not going to attack France. He said that. It's on record. I covered that story at the time. This is the problem. This is the problem with terrorism. There is no discourse, there's no discussion of French foreign policy in this. Instead, we're simply talking about these Kouachi brothers. It's usually a very similar story. You know, young working class kids from a kind of a rough background, and so on and so forth, and they get caught up by a local imam, and then they find themselves in Syria. But who started the war in Syria?
Let's talk about that.
Who's been funding terrorism in Syria?
Let's go to London here. We know these brothers.
Well, let's talk about it. I want to say a couple more things on that.
Let me go to London. We have a terrible sound delay. Let me go to London first, okay? Hafsa, let's talk about those brothers because they had a record. The French authorities knew who they were. They had actually been gone through the criminal justice system in France. They know that they knew at the time that they had gone to Syria, that they probably got some kind of training. Who knows who paid for it? possibly the CIA, possibly patrons of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries. We know all these things. These are facts, really known facts. And then they commit an atrocity in Paris. So I kind of scratch my head here, and I'm quite literally doing it. So all those billions and billions and billions of dollars to fight the war on terror has gone to complete waste because these guys had a police record that no one noticed.
Well, I think, first of all, we need to rename this not the war on terror, but the war of terror, given the extent to which terrorism has spread, initially from just Al-Qaeda to now millions, almost thousands of these groups that are burgeoning everywhere, from Afghanistan. Iraq is now a base. Syria, Libya is open to all sorts of other groups, and of course it's extended all the way into Western Africa. So it hasn't been a war on terror as much as a war of terror that has actually spread this problem across the globe. Now, when you look at France's reaction, I think France's reaction has been nauseating, really, because they've actually managed to hijack, try and gain rather capital from an atrocity and shift as a distraction, really, from their policy, their failed policy. They have managed to they've funded and supported terror in Syria, and now, as a distraction from this atrocity, they're actually claiming that it is in defense of freedom of speech, that it is that France is a beacon of enlightenment, and therefore it's fighting barbarity, where in fact it has encouraged it. It's encouraged it in Syria, it's funded it and supported it and aided it in Libya. So I think this whole march that we're seeing is really a distraction from the utter failures of French policy. And of course, as you mentioned rightly, these two gentlemen were actually on a watch list. They were on no-fly list. They were being followed. So this is a distraction for the utter incompetence in French authorities, A, to first monitor them correctly, B, to stop them, but of course, again, as a distraction from their utter failure in stemming terrorism and, in fact, actually encouraging it abroad.
Okay. Let's go back to Paris here. I know there's a sound delay. I hope you heard most of what we heard from London, but we know who these guys were, but the security state was completely ineffectual in dealing with it.
Yeah, well, I think we need to talk about the ideological function of Al-Qaeda. What is Al-Qaeda? Well, let's go back to what Robin Cook, the former British Foreign Minister, said in the House of Commons before he retired. He reminded his colleagues that Al-Qaeda is a database of CIA military intelligence assets. He didn't deny that it was still the case just before the Iraq War. In the Libyan War, let's just start there. It was quite extraordinary to watch the behavior of the French media. We were subjected to eight months of a horrendous media and disinformation campaign. When Gaddafi was murdered by these jihadists, the former Libyan ambassador to Tripoli spoke to France Culture. Now, he said that he had never seen anything like the disinformation during the war, that it was a disgrace, that it was a sick joke, that this kind of disinformation only works in a land of serfs, but not in a nation of free minds. That was the former French ambassador to Tripoli. We're dealing with a very, very severe form of brainwashing, and the result of that was the demonstrations that we saw the other day. Quite extraordinary. Real Charlie Pied Piper. I mean, this is what it is. It's Charlie Pied Piper.
All right, let me go.
The people.
Let me go back to London here.
Discourse, invidious discourse, which presents Muslims as some kind of a threat.
Okay, let me go back to London here. I looked at the solidarity parade of the leaders that went to Paris, and if you look at social media outside of the main media, state-controlled and state-funded and friendly media, the whole parade of solidarity was scoffed at because of the leaders that were there. And you could go after one right after another in the front row that have actually either supported state terrorism or funded terrorist groups all through the Middle East and around the world. I mean, it didn't. I was really surprised by the uproar of just how dare they take that picture after this terrible event in Paris.
Again, the word nauseating really seems to describe it perfectly well. It was almost a sort of aligning of a usual suspect of all the criminals that have had the worst record in supporting freedom of speech or in supporting any form of freedom and human rights across the globe. All the leaders that are aligned were responsible either for wars, for proxy wars, for acts of terror, or for actually serious suppressions of human rights or freedom of speech. So I think it also, again, I think that image actually encapsulates the sheer hypocrisy that we're seeing from numerous governments, and of course the sheer incompetence coming out of this government, or maybe the double speak rather, is probably more apt. And of course I think it really translates very well into this entire farcical situation the entire globe feels is engulfed in today, whereby we're seeing one day people fighting and talking the talk against terrorism, while in another speech actually funding it and encouraging it and supporting it. So really, I think that lineup of almost at times war criminals, I'm thinking of Benjamin Netanyahu, who was responsible for the killing of 17 Palestinian journalists just this summer. I think that was an utter disgrace, and I think it really does sort of highlight the sheer hypocrisy of our world leaders, and of course the sheer hypocrisy of this entire situation and supposedly war on terror.
Okay, I'm going to have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on extremism. Stay with RT. All right, I'd like to go back to our guest in Paris. One of the things I find very interesting is the target of the first attack in Paris, and it was this media outlet that printed cartoons, and looking at those cartoons, it's pretty hard not to be offended. And obviously that was their intent, that was what they were known for. But it's very interesting that they were chosen, because now you see Western leaders coming out and the outrage supporting them. And of course, in Western tradition, we support the right to express ideas that we may not like. But that's just basically peculiar to the West. And now you have the entire Arab world, Muslim world, looking at who the West supports in their cultures. And it's a very good target, quote unquote, on their part, because it really helps enrage people to see their culture and their religion and their traditions insulted and supported officially by Western governments and leaders.
Many former employees of Charlie Hebdo have described the journal as racist. For example, there was one journalist, one cartoonist who was fired illegally because he criticized Israel. There was an obsession in Charlie Hebdo with criticizing Muslims, ridiculing Muslims, provoking Muslims with with pictures of the Prophet, which were really, really bad taste, weren't very funny and weren't very clever. Yeah. In fact, were very stupid, because it was precisely what Israel wants. Israel wants Muslims to protest in the street against such things. They want to create the impression that there is a problem in Western society with Muslims. Well, here's news. There isn't, and there never has been. Mm-hmm. This is based on the theories of Samuel Huntington or Bernard Lewis and so on, of the clash of civilizations. Well, there never really was a clash of civilizations between Muslims and Christians. They lived together for centuries in Spain and so on, and in different parts of Europe. In fact, European secularism comes from the philosopher Averroes. I mean, all of this is pretty much well known. But what this serves is Israeli foreign policy. Israeli foreign policy is about demonizing Muslims in order to justify their genocide in Gaza. And it's also about using one Muslim community against the other, and the entire Muslim community against non-Muslims. So what we see, what this does is it's a form of divide and conquer imperialism, traditional imperialism, which seeks to divide Arab states by turning one community against the other in order to create the conditions of Israeli hegemony in the Middle East. So, for example, what is happening in Syria is really, what we're seeing now is a blowback from Syria. But what they are doing is they are putting one community against the other. They are demonizing Muslims. And of course, they're supporting Wahhabi death squads. Wahhabism as an ideology is an anti-Muslim ideology. It attacks Muslims. But they are in cahoots, of course, with the Saudi regime. The Saudi regime is a Zionist entity. And the Saudis and the Israelis, the Wahhabo-Zionists, this is what we're dealing with. It's a form. The contemporary imperialism is Wahhabo-Zionism.
Okay.
And they are two sides of the same coin, effectively. And it is Wahhabo Zionism that is destroying Syria.
Okay, Hafsa, if I go back to you in London, it's really interesting is because the West likes to preach its superiority because it is secular, it is beyond tradition and religion and all that. But actually, Western secularism is a religion, and anyone that violates its principles is punished severely. And I'm talking about whistleblowers within its own culture. Do not challenge authority. Do not seek the truth. Always accept foreign policy objectives of being honest and fair. And it happens all of the time. It seems to me that this is the hypocrisy of the West gone extreme. Well, you never question our principles, but your principles are open to interrogation, and because we have the right, we have the might, we have the right to tell you the right path. And this is a form of cultural imperialism. The West cannot see beyond its, the end of its own nose. It's so blind to its own arrogance and its own policies that create so much blowback against the West at the end of the day.
Well, I think, given that this week has been all about journalism and freedom of speech, I think one thing is worth noting is, for instance, if a Russian journalist, for instance, comes and sort of publish something that goes against the official line, he will be regarded in the West as a brave journalist. If a Western journalist in Britain or in the US goes against the official line, he'll be considered a conspiracy theorist. Yeah. So you see, there's this constant double standard. And I have to reiterate about France claiming to be some sort of beacon of freedom of speech. Actually, France, out of all the Western democracies, has some of the most repressive legislation against freedom of expression. Namely, for instance, it has the Gearóid law, which basically means that anyone questioning the official history of the Second World War and maybe presenting some figures that are revised on the victims of the Holocaust, anyone claiming otherwise can actually face up to 5 years in prison. Now, that is incredibly stringent law on anyone expressing their view on a historical matter. Again, almost every single year you have singers and rappers actually facing trial because they've sang songs that were critical of government officials or indeed even of France. So that is something very striking. And of course, you will remember the famous Dieudonné affair, who is a French comedian who, for making jokes that come nowhere near what Charlie Hebdo has published, has been banned by the state. He's been chased. He's been taken to court. I mean, the lynching, the immediate lynching he suffers solely for expressing his right to mock all communities. And he's a black comedian. He's mocked black comedians. He's mocked black presidents, African president. He's mocked Muslim extremists. He's mocked every single body. But on the one occasion where he mocks Israeli extremists, the French apparatus came down on him like a ton of bricks. So this is absolutely fake. There is no such thing as absolute freedom of expression. In France, it seems to me that the only freedom of expression is to target minorities, and the Muslim community is essentially made up of working class people who are not in the highest echelons of power. They're a weak minority, and therefore they're an easy target for rags such as Charlie Hebdo. And I have to say that while the noble job of journalism is to inform people, it's to hold the powers that be to account. A satirical newspaper that exclusively targets minorities, uses the N-word to describe black people, is a disgusting newspaper. And one, at least for me, je ne suis pas Charlie, that's for sure.
Okay, let's go back to Paris here. Let's look at the consequences of what's happened here, because one of the first things I heard that must be done, of course, that's the mantra of U.S. foreign policy in the West, something must be done. And someone has already suggested more stringent control of the internet. Well, I don't understand this here. Terrorism, these are acts of criminality. And why don't you call the police? Why don't you have better forensics? Why don't you just do basic police work? But no, what they want to do is empower the NSA, all the other intelligence agencies. All of them are being redeemed from torture. Now we're just going to go down the same path of just repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And that suits people in Paris, London, and Washington just fine.
Absolutely. There are serious questions, of course, about the actus reus itself. I won't go into them here, but of course, many people have pointed out inconsistencies in the official story and so on, which is quite normal after terrorist attacks. The problem is there's never any investigation. There's never any journalistic investigation. Instead, what you have are stenographers to power, simply repeating what so-and-so said, so someone in power and so on. So you never really get any investigation. There are very serious questions concerning how the act was carried out, why the commandos were taking their time, for example, and what seemed to be very well rehearsed and so on. I mean, there are many, many questions, but those questions will never be asked. What we have in France is a very sophisticated media. It's, I would say, probably more sophisticated than other countries due to the specificities of French history. You have an official left-wing media in France, an official kind of an oppositional media, which has roots in radical politics. L'Humanité was linked to the French Communist Party, for example, and Libération was set up by Jean-Paul Sartre in order to inform the French public about French imperialism. The problem was all of those newspapers have been bought by billionaires and potentates and are now singing from the same hymn sheet. Yeah. And so what you have is this pseudo-leftism, this sort of petty bourgeois moral left that tries to censor more than to, for example, investigate. So, for example, in the war in Libya and the war in Syria, it was the left-wing press that was promoting the war, more even than the official right-wing press. So that is very confusing for somebody who has very little knowledge of left-wing history or very little knowledge of history in general. They get confused. So, for example, these foreign wars, the war particularly in Libya and Syria, were presented as left-wing. And so Charlie Hebdo's function was similar. They all presented themselves as anti-establishment left-wing activists, when in fact what they were very subtly doing is creating this Huntington discourse of the clash of civilizations, a very right-wing agenda. In fact, some of the cartoons against Muslims were very similar to the kind of cartoons you would see against the Irish in 19th century Britain.
Okay.
We saw
we're rapidly running out of time.
A few years ago against Mugabe in Zimbabwe.
We have a huge time delay there. Sorry, folks. Let me go back to London here. I think what we heard there is very interesting, and what you said earlier, Hafsa, is that, again, the West is always talking about plurality, but ever since the end of the Cold War, particularly since 1991, we see the collapse of the entire political spectrum in the West because the left has really abrogated its responsibility. If you look at some of those cartoons, they take a leftist perspective to be racist. I mean, that doesn't seem to make sense at face value, but that's what's happened.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's no longer any opposition in any Western country, really. I remember, I think it was famously Reverend Jesse Jackson who described the political atmosphere in the political arena in the US being that it was Republican and Republican light. And I think throughout the Western Europe, that's pretty much what's happening. Yeah. There is no difference between the Labour Party and the Conservatives. There's no difference between the Socialists in France and the UMP or the right-wing parties. So they're all pretty much implementing the same policies, and therefore the newspapers that have been bought by their supporters are actually promoting the same agenda. This is why there is no opposing views. And this is why when you have acts such as the terrorist act last week, there is absolutely no contradicting view. Everyone starts singing from the same hymn sheet, as the previous, my fellow panelists have said, and everyone just says the same thing and agrees with the official line. And this is the problem when all opposition has been snuffed out and there is only one single view. In a way, it's almost as if we're kind of living in some sort of democratic dictatorship.
Okay, well, at least you have, at least we all have crosstalk here. We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Paris and in London, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules. I love it.